Welcome back, or perhaps welcome for the first time, to Hollow Midnight. If you find yourself in the peculiar state of being both awake and yet utterly unenthused by the prospect of staying that way, you've stumbled into precisely the right digital corner. Before we delve into the curious historical archives of truly terrible advice, consider gently tapping that subscribe button. It's a small act, but it ensures more tales of the mundane, the bizarre, and the historically ill-advised find their way to your weary mind. This evening, we embark upon Chapter 1, the Herbalist's Dubious Credentials. In the year of our Lord 1347, a time before the great pestilence had truly tightened its icy grip, but when life was already a perpetual struggle against dampness, hunger, and an impressive array of minor but irritating ailments, there resided in the muddy outskirts of a moderately unremarkable market town a figure of considerable local notoriety named Master Elixir Sprout. Master Elixir, a title she had with characteristic boldness bestowed upon herself, was not, it must be said, a master of anything in particular, beyond perhaps the art of confidently asserting wildly inaccurate medical theories and cultivating a persistent aroma of overripe cabbage and unwashed wool. Her humble dwelling, which served simultaneously as her apothecary, her laboratory, and her sleeping quarters, was a precarious affair of wattle and daub, perpetually leaning at an alarming angle as if perpetually contemplating a collapse into the adjacent pigsty. The air within was thick and cloying, a suffocating tapestry woven from the pungent threads of drying herbs, the earthy dampness rising from the packed dirt floor, and the faint, unsettling whiff of things long expired. Elixir's stock in trade, her very livelihood, revolved around remedies, or more accurately, attempts at remedies for every conceivable human affliction, from the common cough to the more esoteric moon fever or witch's twitch. But her particular, and quite frankly, most spectacularly unsuccessful, specialty lay in the elusive art of inducing sleep. Sleep, in the 14th century, was less a refreshing respite and more often a brief, fitful battle against fleas' hard beds, the ceaseless creaks and groans of ancient timber, and the very real possibility of a rat scurrying across one's face. Naturally, a good night's rest was a commodity, as rare and coveted as a fresh apple in February, and thus desperate souls, their eyes rimmed with the perpetual shadows of insomnia, would often find themselves, as a last resort, knocking on Elixir's rickety door. Her credentials, as the chapter title so aptly suggests, were dubious in the extreme. They consisted primarily of a heavily stained parchment scroll, purporting to be a direct translation of a forgotten Roman text on humoral alignment to text, which, upon closer inspection, appeared to be little more than a laundry list of vaguely therapeutic plants, interspersed with recipes for particularly unpalatable gruel. She also possessed a small chipped ceramic owl, which she claimed was imbued with the spirit of a forgotten Germanic goddess of slumber, though its primary function seemed to be collecting dust and occasionally toppling over with a dull thud. Her knowledge of herbs was equally eclectic and largely based on a blend of ancient superstition, personal whimsy, and what she called intuitive resonance. If a plant felt sleepy to her, perhaps because it drooped slightly or had particularly fuzzy leaves, then by Jove, it was a sleeping herb. The fact that it might, in reality, be a potent laxative or a mild hallucinogen was for Elixir a mere trifle, a detail best overlooked in the grand pursuit of nocturnal tranquility. Her methods were as theatrical as they were ineffective. A typical consultation would begin with Elixir peering intently at the patient's tongue, then their fingernails, before finally and dramatically consulting an astrological chart drawn crudely on a piece of dried animal hide. Ah, yes, she would declare with a solemn nod, tracing a finger across the constellations of the Great Bear and the Little Ladle. The celestial influence of Saturn is undoubtedly agitating your black bile. pushing the melancholic vapors upwards, thence disrupting the delicate balance of your vital spirits, causing your eyes to remain unnaturally, and quite inconveniently, open put. This pronouncement, while sounding profoundly knowledgeable, was merely a boilerplate diagnosis, applied equally to a miller suffering from chronic backache and a scullery maid plagued by vivid night. Her sleep remedies were legendary, though perhaps not for the reasons she intended. One popular concoction, frequently administered with absolute conviction, was her lunar lullaby draught. This involved the meticulous gathering of dew from 7 distinct types of night-blooming weeds, collected precisely at midnight under a waning gibbous moon, then simmered for 3 days with a pinch of powdered newt bone. A strand of a hangman's rope, sourced, she claimed, with considerable difficulty, and a generous helping of fermented cabbage water. The resulting liquid, a murky, greenish-brown potion that emitted a faint, unsettling shimmer in the candlelight, was said to coax the spirits of the night into embracing the sleepless consciousnesses. In truth, it usually induced an impressive bout of flatulence and a vague sense of unease that lasted until dawn, if it didn't simply cause the patient to vomit. Many reported feeling even more awake, albeit in a deeply uncomfortable and slightly nauseous state, after consuming Elara's celebrated tonic, another of her more imaginative and equally useless prescriptions for sleeplessness involved the creation of a dream pillow. This was not, as one might imagine, a pillow filled with soft feathers or comforting herbs. No, Elara's dream pillow was a small, tightly sewn satchel, no larger than a man's palm, stuffed with a precisely measured amount of dried bat guano, hair clippings from a black cat, gathered only under a new moon, and the shed skin of a particularly lethargic serpent. The instructions were precise. The sufferer was to place this unholy sachet directly beneath their existing pillow, thereby absorbing the restless energies and inviting the ancient spirits of profound slumber. The result was, almost without fail, a restless night spent attempting to ignore the faint, earthy aroma emanating from beneath one's head, coupled with a growing anxiety about the provenance of the various biological material. More than one villager reported developing a peculiar, persistent itch after a week of Elara's dream pillow, a discomfort that did little to encourage peaceful rest. Her most outlandish advice, however, was reserved for those truly desperate souls, the chronic insomniacs who had tried everything else, and were now, frankly, beyond caring about the precise nature of their impending doom. For these unfortunates, Elara would prescribe a ritualistic bath in stagnant pond water, collected, again, under a very specific astrological configuration, mixed with a paste of crushed poppy seeds, which, in a rare stroke of accidental partial efficacy, did contain trace amounts of actual opium, though she was entirely unaware of this, and the ashes of burnt parchment. The patient was then instructed to recite a lengthy, nonsensical incantation backwards while dipping themselves 7 times. The effect was usually a profound chill, the onset of a minor rash, and an overwhelming desire to be anywhere but Elara's dimly lit, damp hovel. Sleep, if it came at all, was likely the result of sheer exhaustion from the ordeal rather than any inherent medicinal property of pond scum. Despite the consistent failures and the growing reputation for delivering more discomfort than cure, Elara Sprout maintained an air of unshakable confidence, a truly magnificent delusion of grandeur. She would attribute any positive outcome, however slight or coincidental, to the precise efficacy of her remedies. Conversely, any lack of improvement, or indeed any worsening of symptoms, was swiftly blamed on the patient's stubborn humors, their insufficient faith in the ancient ways, or, most commonly, a particularly malicious planetary alignment that had unfortunately coincided with the remedy's administration. Her explanations were always convoluted, always shifting, always designed to absolve her of any blame, leaving the customer bewildered, poorer, and often even more awake than they had been before. It was this peculiar blend of unwavering conviction, profound ignorance, and a truly unfortunate selection of ingredients that made Master Elixir sprout such a quintessential example of why one should never, under any circumstances, take sleep advice from a 14th-century herbalist. Her entire operation was a testament to the fact that while desperation might lead one to seek out the strangest remedies, it does not, regrettably, imbue those remedies with any shred of actual scientific merit. And so, as the faint, lingering scent of dried bat guano and stagnant pond water begins to gently waft through the air of our historical imagination, we are left to ponder the sheer absurdity of it all, a quiet testament to the enduring human quest for sleep, no matter how misguided the paths taken to find it. Chapter 2. A time when medicine meant guesswork to truly appreciate the breathtaking audacity and sheer, unadulterated uselessness of Master Elixir Sprout's sleep remedies. One must first immerse oneself in the swirling, murky waters of 14th century medical understanding. It was a time, to put it mildly, when the line between genuine attempts at healing and enthusiastic guesswork was not merely blurred, but utterly obliterated. If modern medicine operates on a foundation of evidence and rigorous testing, medieval medicine was built upon a shimmering mirage of tradition, astrological charts, deeply flawed philosophical theories, and an unwavering faith in the power of things that often made matters demonstrably worse. The prevailing medical paradigm was the ancient theory of the four humors: blood, flame, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, in this view, was not caused by unseen microorganisms or malfunctioning organs, but by an imbalance of these internal bodily fluids. Too much blood, you were sanguine. Too much black bile, melancholic. The cure, therefore, was to restore this delicate equilibrium, often through methods that now sound more like medieval torture than therapeutic intervention. Bloodletting, for instance, was not merely a treatment, it was practically a lifestyle choice. A barber surgeon, with his gleaming, rusty lancet and collection of leeches, was a ubiquitous figure, ready to drain away excess vitality, whether the patient suffered from a fever, a toothache, or a particularly persistent case of existential dread. One might be bled for a headache, or bled for a broken leg, or bled simply because the moon was in an inconvenient constellation and your humors felt bit off. It was a remarkably consistent cure for a remarkably inconsistent array of afflictions, primarily because it consistently weakened the patient, often making them too faint to complain further. Beyond the constant fascination with draining the life force from the ill, other popular treatments included purging, which involved inducing vomiting or violent diarrhea with harsh concoctions of herbs, animal parts, and questionable minerals. The logic was simple: if something was wrong inside, it must be expelled. Naturally, this often led to severe dehydration and further weakened an already vulnerable patient, but the visible expulsion provided a satisfying, if illusory, sense of progress. Cupping, scarification, and the application of various poultices made from anything from pigeons' droppings to boiled nettles were also common. Their efficacy measured more by the patient's desperate hope than by any tangible improvement. In this landscape, the very concept of anatomy was rudimentary at best. Dissections were rare and often illegal, meaning most physicians learned about the human body from ancient texts written by figures like Galen, whose observations, while groundbreaking for their time, were often based on animal dissections and riddled with inaccuracies. The idea of germs was centuries away. Disease was attributed to miasmas's noxious vapors rising from swamps or decaying matter, or, more ominously, to divine punishment, witchcraft, or malevolent spirits. If you were sick, you might first consult your priest for spiritual absolution, then a local wise woman for a charm, and only then, if you had the means, a university-trained physician who would likely prescribe the same bloodletting, purging, and astrological readings. Herbalists, like our master Ilara, occupied a peculiar niche within this chaotic medical ecosystem. They were not typically formally educated in the universities where what passed for medical theory was debated. Instead, their knowledge was often a blend of inherited lore, personal experimentation, sometimes tragically fatal experimentation. Though not for the herbalists themselves, and the doctrine of signatures, this charmingly illogical belief held that a plant's appearance offered clues to its medicinal use. So if a plant had heart-shaped leaves, it must be good for the heart. If a root looked like a human limb, it could cure ailments of that limb. And if a plant looked particularly dull or droopy, well, it simply must be good for sleep, regardless of its actual chemical properties. This was where Ilara truly excelled, applying this interpretive art with a particularly creative, and often counterproductive, flourish. The desperate public, living in a world of constant physical discomfort, short lifespans, and pervasive fear, had few options. The trained physicians were expensive, concentrated in larger towns, and, as we've noted, often just as prone to prescribing ineffective, even harmful, treatments. The local herbalist, like Ilara, was accessible, affordable, at least in principle, and offered a sense of hope, however misplaced. They spoke the language of the common folk, used ingredients that seemed familiar, and often provided a much-needed sympathetic ear, even if their advice was nonsensical. It was a comforting delusion, a whisper of control in a world that offered very little. For someone suffering from chronic sleeplessness, the medieval world offered no panacea. There were no sleeping pills, no melatonin, no understanding of sleep hygiene or circadian rhythms. Instead, you were likely told your humors were out of balance, your liver was too hot, or perhaps a mischievous spirit was tickling your brain at night. The remedies offered were therefore equally disconnected from any actual physiological understanding of sleep. They targeted imaginary imbalances or invoked supernatural intervention, rather than addressing the actual mechanisms of wakefulness. So, when Master Ilara proudly presented her lunar lullaby draught, or instructed a patient to sleep with a satchel of bat guano, she wasn't necessarily an outlier in the grand scheme of medieval medical absurdity. She was, in many ways, a symptom of the era itself, a time when scientific inquiry was nascent, when superstition held sway, and when the human body was largely an enigma, a complex machine whose inner workings were interpreted through vague analogies and cosmic influence. Her dubious credentials were less an exception, and more a microcosm of the prevailing medical landscape. The danger lay not just in her personal lack of expertise, but in the entire prevailing mindset that allowed such practices to flourish unchecked. Patients, their bodies aching and minds frayed from lack of rest, were truly grasping at straws, and Ilara, with her confident pronouncements and unsettling potions, was simply one of the more peculiar straws available. The true tragedy, and indeed the dark humor of it all, was that in their desperate pursuit of a simple night's peace, they often found themselves plunging deeper into a quagmire of discomfort, confusion, and sometimes entirely new ailments, all thanks to the wisdom of their local, self-proclaimed sleep expert, in a time when medicine was truly just a sophisticated form of guesswork. Chapter 3. The Sleep Elixir, mostly wine, occasionally poison, having delved into the murky professional standing of Master Ilara Sprout and the bewildering landscape of 14th-century medical practice. It's only fair we now turn our attention to the actual potions she brewed, the very concoctions that were meant to usher her sleepless clients into the comforting arms of Morpheus, but more often served as a one-way ticket to a different, less pleasant kind of oblivion. Her famed lunar lullaby draught, previously mentioned in hushed, slightly nauseated tones, was but one example of a category of remedies that, when broken down, revealed themselves to be less about pharmacology and more about a dangerously optimistic blend of folk belief, desperate hope, and a startling lack of understanding regarding basic toxicology. The core truth about many a medieval sleep elixir was often brutally simple. It was mostly wine, occasionally poison, and rarely, if ever, a genuinely effective or safe sedative. Let us begin with the base. The very foundation of nearly every medieval potion, be it for love, courage, or, in Elara's case, slumber. That foundation was almost universally alcohol, most commonly in the form of cheap, often sour, wine. Now, one might think, wine. A natural soporific. Perhaps Elara wasn't entirely misguided after all. And indeed, a glass or two of wine can certainly make one feel drowsy. However, the medieval approach was less about a gentle evening tipple, and more about achieving a state of profound inebriation, the logic being that if you were sufficiently sloshed, your body would simply give up the ghost of wakefulness and collapse into unconsciousness. Wine was plentiful, relatively easy to acquire, and served as an excellent solvent and preservative for the various, often repulsive, ingredients Elara saw fit to add. The immediate effect of copious amounts of alcohol might indeed be a heavy-lidded stupor, a kind of forced, shallow sleep, but the long-term consequences were often ignored, or simply attributed to stubborn humors. Dehydration, restless sleep once the initial stupor wore off, and the insidious creep of dependency were all common side effects, leaving the patient ultimately more exhausted and often even more prone to insomnia than before. They weren't sleeping better. They were simply drunk. And waking up with a splitting headache in a world already replete with discomfort was hardly the restful outcome promised. Beyond the fermented grape, the true peril and occasional, unintentional efficacy of these elixirs lay in the herbal additions. One of the few plants known to medieval herbalists that actually possessed potent sedative properties was the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum decotir. Elara, in a rare moment of accidental near-correctness, sometimes included crushed poppy seeds in her concoctions. What she, and indeed most practitioners of her era, failed to grasp was the precise distinction between a culinary sprinkle of poppy seeds, which contain negligible amounts of opiates, and the far more potent latex extracted from the unripe seed pods. If, by some cosmic coincidence, Elara managed to get her hands on the actual raw opium, or parts of the plant containing significant concentrations of morphine and codeine, then her patient might indeed experience a profound, albeit dangerous, state of sedation. The problem, of course, was dosage. There were no calibrated scales, no understanding of micrograms or milligrams, no concept of active ingredients. It was a pinch, a handful, enough to make the mixture feel right. This meant a patient might receive a negligible, useless amount, or a fatal dose, with no middle ground. Respiratory depression, nausea, profound constipation, and a terrifying descent into addiction were not considered side effects. They were simply what happened when one's humors were being realigned or purified. The sleep induced by true opium was less restorative and more akin to a comatose state, a heavy, dreamless oblivion from which waking could be a struggle, if it happened at all. Then there were the plants whose names alone still send shivers down the spine of any modern toxicologist. The truly dangerous, the spectacularly poisonous, yet frequently prescribed botanical agents. First among these was mandrake, Mandragora officinarum. Its root, often uncannily resembling a grotesque human form, was imbued with immense mystical power and was believed to possess powerful narcotic properties. And it did, but not in a good way. Mandrake contains potent anticholinergic alkaloids like atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. These compounds can indeed induce a stupor, but it's a stupor accompanied by vivid, terrifying hallucinations, delirium, extreme agitation, followed by profound sedation, a dangerously accelerated heart rate, and often death. A patient given mandrake for sleep might certainly cease to be restless, but they might also cease to breathe. The legends of the mandrake screaming when pulled from the earth, and those who heard it dying instantly, while fanciful, hinted at the plant's very real and lethal potency. Elara, with her penchant for dramatic flourish, would undoubtedly have delighted in using such a powerful and ancient herb, blissfully unaware that she was essentially administering a potentially lethal cocktail. Closely related in its chemical makeup, and equally hazardous, was henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, often cultivated in medieval gardens. It too contained the same dangerous alkaloids as mandrake. Herbalists used it for pain relief and sedation, but again without any understanding of safe dosage. Ingesting henbane could lead to blurred vision, dry mouth, extreme confusion, agitation, hallucinations, convulsions, coma, and again, death. It was a plant known to induce a witch's trance for a reason. Its effects were disorienting, terrifying, and profoundly toxic. A good night's sleep was unlikely. A bad trip to the underworld was far more probable. And we cannot forget belladonna, or deadly nightshade, Eotropa belladonna. Its berries, alluringly dark and glossy, were particularly dangerous. While historically used to dilate pupils, hence belladonna, or beautiful lady, its potent anticholinergic properties meant that internal consumption was a recipe for disaster. A few berries could be fatal. Symptoms included severe delirium, convulsions, respiratory failure, and cardiac arrest. To administer this for sleep was to invite the Grim Reaper for a bedtime story. Yet, in the absence of scientific understanding, and guided by the doctrine of signatures, perhaps the dark berries suggested deep sleep, or simply by anecdote and misinterpretation, it found its way into countless desperate patients. Then there were the truly baffling, the utterly inert, and the actively contaminating ingredients that populated Elara's remedies. The powdered newt bone, or hair clippings from a black cat, were harmless enough in themselves, beyond the slight mental discomfort of knowing what you were ingesting. These elements were added not for their chemical properties, but for their perceived magical or sympathetic influence. The newt, being cold-blooded and sluggish, might impart lethargy. The black cat, nocturnal and mysterious, might draw in the night. The shed skin of a particularly lethargic serpent was another nod to sympathetic magic, assuming the serpent's laziness would rub off on the sleepless patient. These were at best placebos with a side of potential bacterial contamination, offering no real benefit beyond the power of belief, and at worst, vectors for unpleasant pathogens from the very real, and often unclean, world they came from. And let us not overlook the 7 distinct types of night-blooming weeds. The fermented cabbage water, or the stagnant pond water. While the weeds might occasionally include something with a mild sedative effect, it was more likely they were simply common plants, many of them benign, some irritating, and some, like nightshade, potentially lethal, all bundled together without any clear identification or testing. The fermented cabbage water would have added a delightful aroma, and perhaps some beneficial probiotics, unbeknownst to Elara, but primarily served as a pungent, if harmless, diluent. The stagnant pond water, however, was a masterstroke of bacterial roulette. Full of algae, protozoa, and myriad microorganisms, it guaranteed a robust case of gastrointestinal distress, if not something far more serious like dysentery. One might argue that the ensuing abdominal cramps and frequent trips to the privy might indeed exhaust a person into a fitful sleep, but it was hardly the peaceful, restorative slumber they sought. The profound danger of these elixirs lay not just in the presence of potent toxins, but in the complete absence of standardization. One day, Elara might inadvertently use a relatively benign batch of poppies, yielding little effect. The next, she might stumble upon a particularly potent patch of wild henbane, resulting in a patient's violent delirium. There was no quality control, no scientific understanding of chemical reactions between ingredients. and certainly no concept of a dose-response curve. Every draft was a lottery, every remedy a roll of the dice with the patient's health, and often their life, as the stakes. So when a desperate medieval insomniac approached Master Elara Sprout, seeking solace from the relentless tyranny of wakefulness, they were not merely purchasing a folk remedy. They were engaging in a perilous act of faith, drinking from a goblet that might contain little more than alcoholic water, or it might contain enough botanical poison to send them to their eternal rest rather than just a temporary one. The dark humor arises from the sheer, mind-boggling incompetence, the chilling nonchalance with which these potentially lethal substances were mixed and administered. It highlights that the 14th century search for sleep was truly a gamble, where the cure was often far more terrifying than the affliction, and the peaceful dreams sought were often indistinguishable from a toxic coma. Chapter 4. Leeches for Insomnia. A bloody mistake. If the medieval sleep elixir was a gamble with one's internal organs and continued existence, then the more invasive treatments for sleeplessness were a full-blown descent into the grotesque. In a world where the primary medical theory revolved around the balancing of 4 bodily humus blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bilate, was perhaps inevitable that the solution to any perceived imbalance, including the torment of insomnia, would often involve the physical removal of said humors. And when one speaks of removing humors, one almost exclusively speaks of blood. Thus, for the chronically sleepless of the 14th century, the promise of rest often came wrapped in the chilling prospect of a draining, bloody, and ultimately profoundly misguided procedure. The theory was elegantly simple, if entirely incorrect. If a person was restless, agitated, and unable to sleep, it was often attributed to an excess of blood or sanguine humor, which was thought to be hot and moist, leading to an overabundance of energy and a fiery disposition. Alternatively, the sleeplessness could be blamed on an excess of yellow bile, making one choleric and prone to irritability, or an imbalance of black bile, leading to melancholic brooding. Regardless of the specific humoral diagnosis, the prevailing solution was often the same: get rid of the perceived excess. And the most direct, most universally applied method of achieving this was bloodletting. Imagine, if you will, the scene. Not Master Elara's cluttered, cabbage-scented hovel this time, but perhaps the more austere, though equally unsanitary, quarters of a local barber surgeon. This individual, often a busy man who split his time between shaving beards and performing minor surgical procedures, would approach the sleepless patient not with a soothing herbal brew, but with a collection of gleaming, often unsterilized instruments, a sharp lancet, a set of cupping glasses, and a polished brass bleeding bowl to catch the flow. The air would be thick with anticipation, the patient's stomach churning not just from lack of sleep, but from genuine apprehension. The procedure itself was deceptively straightforward. The barber surgeon might feel the patient's pulse, consult a rudimentary astrological chart to determine the most auspicious time, and often the most appropriate vein based on the zodiac sign. And then, with a confident flourish that belied the lack of true understanding, select a vein in the arm, ankle, or even the forehead. A tourniquet might be applied to make the vein swell, or perhaps not, depending on the practitioner's whim. Then a swift, sharp incision with the lancet. The blood, dark and viscous, would flow, often pooling rapidly in the waiting bowl. The amount to be drawn was entirely arbitrary, sometimes a mere cupful, sometimes enough to cause profound faintness or even collapse. The patient was expected to remain still, enduring the cold prick of the steel, the warm gush of their own vital fluid, and the growing lightheadedness. The rationale for how this would induce sleep was, to modern ears, astonishing. The idea was that by removing excess blood, the body would be cooled, the agitation would subside, and the overly stimulated humors would return to a tranquil balance. For a patient tormented by restless nights, The immediate effect of bloodletting could indeed appear to be beneficial. The profound weakness, the dizzy spells, the sheer physiological shock of losing a significant amount of blood often led to a state of exhaustion so complete that sleep, however shallow and fitful, might indeed follow. It wasn't restful sleep or curative sleep. It was the body's desperate shutdown mechanism. You weren't sleeping because you were healed. You were sleeping because you were too weak to stay awake. And waking from such a sleep often meant a splitting headache, a bone-deep weariness, and a new vulnerability to every passing plague, thanks to a weakened immune system. The irony was palpable. To cure insomnia, one might be put into a state that made them even more acutely aware of their own fragile mortality. But what if the patient was too frail for a full bloodletting? Or what if the imbalance was considered more localized, more subtle? This is where the humble, yet undeniably horrifying, leech entered the medieval medical stage. Leeches, often kept in murky jars, slimy and writhing, were the more gentle alternative to the lancet. They were still about removing blood, but in a less dramatic, more controlled, though still deeply unhygienic, fashion. The typical scenario for treating insomnia with leeches involved placing these segmented, parasitic worms directly onto the patient's skin, often near the temples, behind the ears, or on the neck areas believed to be close to the seat of agitation, or areas from which bad humors could be easily drawn. The leech, with its impressive array of suckers and a three-jawed bite, would latch on, secreting an anticoagulant to ensure a steady flow of blood. The patient would feel a mild prick, then a strange, sucking, tugging sensation as the creature slowly engorged itself, swelling visibly with the patient's own precious fluid. Visually, it was a deeply unsettling sight. Black, glistening worms steadily bloating, their bodies pulsing with the very lifeblood they were extracting. The medieval patient, likely already on edge from weeks of sleeplessness, would endure this peculiar form of acupuncture, silently praying that the discomfort and the slow drain would indeed usher in the promised slumber. The belief was that the leech, by drawing blood from specific points, was selectively removing the bad or excessive humors that were causing the sleeplessness. It was a more targeted, albeit equally unscientific, approach to blood removal. The aftermath of a leeching session was hardly conducive to restful sleep. The bite marks, though small, would often continue to bleed for hours, or even days, thanks to the leech's anticoagulant saliva. This could lead to messy bedding, skin irritation, and a lingering sense of unease. Infections were also a constant threat, as the leeches themselves were rarely cleaned or sterilized, often being reused on multiple patients without a thought to cross-contamination. So, while the immediate physical impact might be less severe than a full-blown bloodletting, the long-term discomfort and risk of secondary issues were still considerable. And the sleep that followed was again, primarily, a product of physical depletion and discomfort, rather than any true resolution of the underlying issue. Imagine trying to drift off while a dozen small, itchy bites weep blood onto your pillow. Not exactly a recipe for serene slumber. Master Ilara Sprout, while preferring her complex potions, was not above incorporating elements of these practices into her more holistic and chaotic approach. She might not personally wield a lancet, for that was the domain of the barber surgeon, but her diagnosis would be steeped in the humoral theory that necessitated such procedures. She might well advise a patient, in conjunction with her lunar lullaby draught, to also seek out a reputable, or at least available, barber surgeon for a bloodletting, or perhaps suggest the application of leeches to specific points on the body, claiming it would release the agitated humors that cling to the very surface of the skin, hindering the passage of calming moon vapors into the soul. Her explanations were always convoluted enough to make sense only to herself, but her clients, desperate for any relief, would listen intently. In some cases, she might even dabble in rudimentary, superficial bloodletting herself, using a small, sharp tool to make tiny pricks, perhaps on the fingertips or behind the ears, claiming it was for symbolic release or to open the pathways for the sleep spirits. Such practices were less about significant blood loss and more about ritual, though still carrying the risk of infection. The more significant trainings, however, she would defer to the professionals, knowing that a patient weakened by the barber's art would be far more amenable to her less violent, though equally ineffective, concoctions. The sheer desperation of the medieval insomniac is truly brought into sharp focus by these methods. Imagine being so utterly exhausted, so plagued by the ceaseless tyranny of wakefulness, that you would willingly submit to having your precious blood drained, or to having slimy, biting worms feed upon your flesh. The hope, however slim, that this gruesome ritual might finally grant a moment's peace was powerful enough to override all sense of comfort, hygiene, or even self-preservation. It paints a vivid, albeit disturbing, picture of a time when the search for sleep was not about comfort or soothing routines, but about battling unseen forces with the blunt, often brutal, tools of humoral theory and crude folk practice. The sleep that came from such treatments was less a balm for the weary soul, and more a temporary capitulation of the body, a bloody mistake in the relentless pursuit of slumber. Chapter 5. The Curse of Night Air and Other Nonsense. Having navigated the treacherous terrain of Master Elixir, sprouts dubious credentials, the chaotic expanse of medieval medical theory, and the often lethal reality of her sleep elixirs and bloody remedies. It's time to confront the very bedrock of medieval understanding regarding the cause of sleeplessness itself. For in a world devoid of germ theory, neurobiology, or even rudimentary understandings of physiology, the causes of maladies were often attributed to forces far more mystical, far more atmospheric, and frankly far more absurd than any physical ailment. Insomnia, that most tormenting of human conditions, was no exception. It was a time when the common lament, "I simply cannot sleep," was met not with questions about stress or diet, but with solemn warnings about malevolent night air, whispering demons, and the ill will of unseen forces. One of the most pervasive and deeply ingrained superstitions was the profound and undeniable danger of night air. To modern ears, a phrase might conjure images of cool, refreshing breezes, the sweet scent of blooming jasmine or the distant hoot of an owl. To the medieval mind, however, night air was a thick, noxious miasma, a palpable exhalation of disease and despair that settled upon the land after dusk. It was believed to carry the vapors of decaying matter, the putrid breath of the earth itself, and most terrifyingly, the very essence of sickness. Miasma theory, as we briefly touched upon, held that bad smells and foul air were the primary vectors of illness, and night air, with its dampness and chill, was considered particularly virulent. Consequently, medieval homes, already cramped, dimly lit, and often shared with livestock, became suffocating bastions against this invisible menace. Windows, if they existed at all beyond a mere slit, were tightly shuttered and doors firmly bolted. Any crack or crevice through which the insidious night air might seep was considered a perilous vulnerability. People would often sleep with their heads covered, sometimes even beneath thick blankets, in a desperate attempt to create a personal, protective cocoon against the airborne threats. The irony, of course, was that this fervent avoidance of night air led to rooms that were stagnant, poorly ventilated, and ripe with the very conditions that fostered actual disease, from respiratory ailments to the proliferation of fleas and other vermin that ensured a night of perpetual itching, thus guaranteeing sleeplessness. The fear of what was outside the window prevented any fresh air from entering, condemning the occupants to breathe air heavy with their own exhalations, the lingering stench of hearth smoke, and the peculiar aroma of unwashed humanity and livestock, a recipe for genuine physical discomfort and restless nights. Master Elixir sprout, ever the shrewd interpreter of popular fears, capitalized on this dread of night air with her characteristic blend of conviction and chaos. For a patient complaining of sleeplessness, her eyes perpetually darting as if seeing phantoms in the shadows, Ilara would nod sagely. "Ah, yes," she might declare, her voice a low conspiratorial rumble, "the very vapors of the moon shadow are clinging to your inner humors, drawing forth the restless spirit from your very bones. You must seal the breach." Her remedies for this pervasive ethereal threat were as inventive as they were useless. She might prescribe a ritualistic burning of certain pungent, often unpleasant, herbs near the patient's bedside, ostensibly to purify the air and drive away the clinging miasmas. These purifying herbs often included things like dried dung, rancid animal fats mixed with some strong-smelling but inert plant matter, or sometimes even small quantities of sulfur, which produced a choking, acrid smoke that would undoubtedly clear any room, but also any lingering desire to breathe comfortably. The resulting coughing fits and irritated eyes were, naturally, interpreted as the struggle of the malign vapors being expelled, rather than the simple physiological response to inhaling toxic fumes. Beyond the atmospheric terrors, medieval sleeplessness was also frequently attributed to the direct intervention of malevolent supernatural entities. The medieval mind was a vibrant tapestry woven with threads of fervent faith and primal fear, where the unseen world was as real, if not more real, than the visible one. Demons, witches, and mischievous spirits were not figments of imagination. They were tangible forces, ever present and eager to torment the living. For the insomniac, this often manifested as the terrifying visitation of the mare, a succubus or incubus that would sit upon the sleeper's chest, pressing down with an invisible weight, stealing breath, and inducing horrifying nightmares that left one paralyzed with fear and utterly unable to move or cry out. This chilling phenomenon, now understood as sleep paralysis, was a very real and terrifying experience, explained away as a demonic assault rather than a temporary neurological hiccup during the transition between sleep stages. For those afflicted by such demonic visitations, Ilara had a whole new arsenal of absurdity. She would prescribe the placement of specific protective amulets beneath the pillow, often small, crudely carved wooden effigies, or a bag containing a handful of rusty nails, a dried toad's leg, and a lock of her own graying hair for a significant additional fee. These items, she would explain, were imbued with counter-spirits that would repel the shadowy fiends and seal the portal through which the night hags enter your dreaming mind. The logic was simple. If a demon was causing your sleeplessness, you needed a counter-demon, or at least something sufficiently off-putting to deter it. Patients, desperate for any shred of comfort, would often find themselves trying to sleep on a lumpy, uncomfortable pillow with a small, hard, and unsettling bag of decomposing animal parts beneath it, the very physical discomfort and psychological unease working against any chance of actual rest. Witchcraft, too, was a convenient scapegoat for any inexplicable ailment, and chronic insomnia was a prime candidate. If a villager had offended a neighbor, or perhaps simply crossed a path at an inauspicious moment, they might find themselves cursed with sleepless nights. The witch, it was believed, could steal one's sleep, leaving them in a perpetual state of weary wakefulness. Divine punishment was another common explanation, particularly for those who believed they had sinned or fallen out of God's favor. Sleeplessness, in this context, was a torment sent from above, a penance for unconfessed transgressions, leaving the sufferer to wrestle not only with their physical discomfort, but also with profound spiritual guilt. Ilara's advice for these spiritual afflictions would often veer into the overtly ritualistic. For a suspected witch's curse, she might instruct the patient to bury a piece of their clothing at a crossroads under a specific moon. or to drink a concoction made from rainwater collected from a church gargoyle mixed with blessed, by Ilara, of course, graveyard dirt. For divine displeasure, she would often recommend a series of increasingly uncomfortable penances, often involving self-flagellation with a bundle of nettles before bed, or a prolonged vigil in a cold, drafty corner of the local church, all designed to purify the soul and appease the heavenly host. The exhaustion from these rituals, rather than the rituals themselves, might indeed lead to a temporary collapse into sleep, but the underlying fear and anxiety often remained a constant companion to their weary consciousness. Beyond the directly malevolent, there was also a pervasive belief in the subtle yet powerful influence of the celestial bodies. While humoral theory already incorporated planetary alignments into diagnosis, the medieval mind often attributed more direct, almost personal, effects to the planets. A particularly mischievous Saturn might bind the eyelids open, or a fiery Mars might inflame the restless spirit. Ilara, with her crudely drawn astrological charts, would meticulously trace the celestial paths, purporting to identify the exact cosmic culprit for a client's wakefulness. The confluence of Jupiter and the wandering star Venus is creating a discord within your sleep centers, she might exclaim, gesturing wildly at her stained parchment. Her proposed solutions would involve sleeping in a specific orientation relative to the stars, or consuming herbs harvested only on certain planetary days, or even attempting to negotiate with the celestial entities through elaborate, whispered incantations before retiring. The specific and often contradictory nature of these astronomical diagnoses meant that her advice was constantly shifting, keeping her clients in a perpetual state of bewilderment and ensuring they remained dependent on her unique insights. The tragicomic reality of these medieval sleep cures was that they entirely missed the mark. While people genuinely suffered from insomnia, the root causes were often far more mundane and far less glamorous than demons or planetary curses. Poor diet, riddled with indigestible grains and lacking in vital nutrients, contributed to discomfort. Chronic pain from hard labor, old injuries, or untreated infections ensured constant physical torment. Unhygienic living conditions led to pervasive itching from fleas and lice. The sheer noise of communal living, from snoring family members to restless livestock, and the constant creaking of ancient buildings, made quiet rest a luxury. The biting cold of winter or the stifling heat of summer, combined with inadequate bedding, added to the misery. All of these very real, very physical, and very tangible factors conspired to create a world where a good night's sleep was a rare and precious commodity. Yet, instead of addressing these practical issues, the medieval mind, and indeed practitioners like Master Ilara Sprout, concocted elaborate, explanations and remedies that perpetuated the cycle of fear and discomfort. The human need to understand and control the unknown led to a rich tapestry of superstition, but it rarely led to actual solutions. The patient who sealed their windows against night air would suffer from stuffiness. The one who prayed away demons would still itch from fleas. The one who aligned themselves with the stars would still wake from a rumbling stomach. It was a profound, almost poetic misunderstanding of the human body and its environment. And Ilara, with her unwavering conviction in the face of consistent failure, stood as a monument to this pervasive ignorance, peddling her bizarre theories, and even more bizarre remedies, truly embodying the curse of night air and other such nonsense. The journey to a restful night in the 14th century was less a path to slumber, and more a winding, uncomfortable detour through a maze of fear, folklore, and profound, often comical error. Chapter 6. Prayer over Potions. The Church's sleep advice, having journeyed through the unsettling pharmacopoeia of Master Elara Sprout and the bewildering landscape of medieval medical ignorance, where the very air was suspect and invisible demons lurked to steal one's slumber, it is crucial to understand that there was another, equally powerful, and often even more pervasive authority dictating the understanding and treatment of human suffering: the Church. In the 14th century, the Church was not merely a spiritual guide. It was the bedrock of society, the interpreter of meaning, and often the primary recourse for those afflicted by ailments, both physical and spiritual. And in an age where the line between the two was perpetually blurred, a persistent inability to sleep was frequently diagnosed, not as a medical condition, but as a profound spiritual crisis, leading to remedies that prioritized prayer over potions, and often led to even more peculiar and prolonged forms of sleeplessness. To the medieval mind, illness, especially a persistent and inexplicable one like chronic insomnia, was often viewed through a theological lens. It could be a divine punishment for unconfessed sins, a test of faith from a benevolent but demanding God, or perhaps most terrifyingly, the insidious work of demonic forces or the malevolent influence of witches. In such a spiritual ecosystem, rushing to a herbalist like Elara with her dubious brews and earthy concoctions might be considered a necessary last resort. But the first, most natural, and most culturally ingrained response for a tormented insomniac was to turn to their local priest. The priest, unlike the barber surgeon or the self-proclaimed herbalist, possessed a unique authority. He was the gatekeeper to divine grace, the interpreter of Scripture, and the primary bulwark against the forces of darkness. If sleeplessness was a burden of the soul, only the Church held the key to its alleviation. The initial consultation with the priest would often begin not with an examination of the tongue or the pulse, but with a deeply probing confession. For many, the relentless tyranny of wakefulness was inextricably linked to a nagging sense of guilt, a secret sin, or a perceived transgression against God's law. The belief was that an unburdened soul, free from the weight of iniquity, would naturally find peace, and with peace would come sleep. The very act of confessing, of laying bare one's perceived failings before a spiritual authority, could indeed offer immense psychological relief, a comforting balm to a troubled conscience. For some, the anxiety stemming from religious scrupulosity might genuinely be a root cause of their insomnia, and in such cases, sincere confession and absolution could theoretically pave the way for a more restful night. But of course, this only addressed a very specific, and perhaps minority, form of insomnia, leaving the vast majority of physically tormented sleepless souls still very much awake. If confession alone proved insufficient, or if the sleeplessness was deemed to be a more severe spiritual malady, the priest might prescribe a regimen of intense spiritual discipline. This often included rigorous penance designed to purify the soul and demonstrate fervent devotion. Imagine, if you will, a peasant woman, her eyes perpetually shadowed from weeks of wakefulness, kneeling on the cold, damp stone floor of the village church, hour after hour, reciting endless paternosters and Ave Marias, her knees aching, her back protesting, her mind cycling through prayers instead of dreams, or perhaps being instructed to fast for extended periods, or to perform acts of self-flagellation, striking oneself with bundles of nettles or light whips, all under the grim belief that physical suffering would appease divine wrath and bring spiritual peace, thereby unlocking the elusive gift of sleep. The irony, of course, was that these acts of extreme devotion, while perhaps purifying the soul in a theological sense, were physically exhausting and often painful, driving the body into a state of collapse that might indeed lead to a shallow, unrefreshing sleep. It was not the rest of true slumber, but the unconsciousness of sheer, bone-deep fatigue, induced by the rigors of religious devotion rather than any actual physiological cure for insomnia. One might wake up feeling spiritually lighter, but physically even more battered and weary. Beyond personal penance, the Church offered an array of protective measures against the unseen forces believed to cause sleeplessness. Holy water, blessed by the priest, was a potent weapon against demons and malign spirits. A sleepless individual might be advised to sprinkle holy water liberally around their bed, across their threshold, or even to drink small quantities of it before retiring, in the hope that its purifying power would cleanse the space and repel any nocturnal tormentors. Similarly, the use of sacred objects was common. Small crucifixes, rosary beads, fragments of blessed cloth, or even genuine or purported relics of saints of bone shard, a strand of hair, a piece of clothing might be placed directly under the pillow or held close to the body throughout the night. The belief was that the inherent holiness of these objects would create a divine barrier, offering protection and peace. The comforting presence of a tangible symbol of faith might indeed alleviate some of the psychological distress associated with fear of the dark or spiritual attack. But for the sufferer whose sleeplessness stemmed from chronic pain, an uncomfortable mattress, or simply the biological quirk of their own sleep cycle, a relic beneath the pillow was unlikely to achieve anything more than a new lump. For the most severe and seemingly intractable cases of sleeplessness, especially those accompanied by bizarre dreams, hallucinations, or fits of agitation, the ultimate and most terrifying intervention was the possibility of exorcism. If the sleeplessness was a sign of demonic oppression, then a priest, typically one with specific training or an established reputation for spiritual warfare, might be called upon to perform a ritual to cast out the malevolent entity. While full-blown possession leading to levitation and speaking in tongues was rare, milder forms of demonic influence, manifesting as profound despair, uncontrollable thoughts, or unrelenting sleeplessness, were often attributed to such forces. The exorcism ritual itself could be a harrowing ordeal, involving lengthy prayers, demands for the demon to reveal itself, and often the physical restraint of the afflicted individual. If, by sheer psychological shock and exhaustion, the person eventually collapsed into a temporary stupor, it was hailed as a victory against the forces of evil, rather than a physiological reaction to extreme stress. The patient might sleep for a few hours, only to awaken to the same terror, now compounded by the memory of the exorcism. Master Elara Sprout, with her more earthy and less overtly spiritual approach, would have had a complex relationship with the Church's influence. On the one hand, she understood that many of her clients would have first sought divine intervention, often finding it wanting in its tangible effects. This created an opening for her to present her physical remedies as a necessary complement. She might even subtly critique the Church's approach, suggesting that while prayer was undoubtedly vital for the soul, the e-body's humors often required a more practical adjustment, a task for which only her potent concoctions and curious rituals were suited. She might even blend the two, advising a client to seek both prayer and her lunar lullaby draft, thereby covering all spiritual and humoral bases, and ensuring she maintained her own relevance. She might bless her own herbs with an incantation she derived from some forgotten pagan text, claiming it was an ancient form of spiritual purification, making her own remedies seem just as potent, if not more so, than the local priest's holy water. The Church, for its part, would have largely tolerated herbalists like Elara, so long as they did not overtly challenge theological dogma or engage in practices deemed outright witchcraft. There was a pragmatic understanding that while God's will was supreme, some earthly ailments also required earthly intervention, even if that intervention was as nonsensical as Elara's. However, the Church's overarching narrative that suffering was often spiritually driven meant that genuine physiological problems were frequently misunderstood and misaddressed. Insomnia, stemming from poor nutrition, a painful tooth, a flea infestation, or the simple anxiety of living in a harsh, uncertain world, was pathologized as a moral failing or a demonic curse. The remedies offered endless prayers, fasting, vigils, or the strategic placement of a saint's bone were potent spiritual tools. But medically, they were often ineffective or even counterproductive, adding physical stress to an already weary body. The enduring legacy of this era's approach to sleep is a poignant one. While modern science has unveiled the intricate neural pathways and hormonal balances that govern our sleep cycles, the medieval world grappled with the terrifying unknown, attributing restless nights to vengeful spirits and unbalanced humors. The Church, with its immense spiritual authority, offered solace and meaning, but in doing so, it often inadvertently perpetuated a cycle of ineffective treatment, directing the desperate insomniac towards solutions that brought spiritual comfort, but little actual rest. The juxtaposition of a profound spiritual quest for peace, with the mundane reality of a physical body yearning for sleep, creates a darkly humorous tableau, a testament to humanity's enduring struggle with the quiet tyranny of wakefulness, and the often bizarre lengths to which we will go to escape its clutches, even when the advice comes from the holiest of places, and is, for the purpose of sleep, entirely, delightfully, and utterly useless. Chapter 7. The Herbalist's Dream Diary. A comedy of errors having journeyed through the unsettling pharmacopoeia of Master Elara Sprout, and the bewildering landscape of medieval medical ignorance, where the very air was suspect and invisible demons lurked to steal one's slumber, it is crucial to understand that there was another, equally powerful, and often even more pervasive authority dictating the understanding and treatment of human suffering: the Church. In the 14th century, the Church was not merely a spiritual guide. It was the bedrock of society, the interpreter of meaning, and often the primary recourse for those afflicted by ailments both physical and spiritual. And in an age where the line between the two was perpetually blurred, a persistent inability to sleep was frequently diagnosed, not as a medical condition, but as a profound spiritual crisis, leading to remedies that prioritized prayer over potions, and often led to even more peculiar and prolonged forms of sleeplessness. To the medieval mind, illness, especially a persistent and inexplicable one like chronic insomnia, was often viewed through a theological lens. It could be a divine punishment for unconfessed sins, a test of faith from a benevolent but demanding God, or, perhaps most terrifyingly, the insidious work of demonic forces or the malevolent influence of witches. In such a spiritual ecosystem, rushing to a herbalist like Elara, with her dubious brews and earthy concoctions, might be considered a necessary last resort, but the first, most natural, and most culturally ingrained response for a tormented insomniac was to turn to their local priest. The priest, unlike the barber surgeon or the self-proclaimed herbalist, possessed a unique authority. He was the gatekeeper to divine grace, the interpreter of Scripture, and the primary bulwark against the forces of darkness. If sleeplessness was a burden of the soul, only the Church held the key to its alleviation. The initial consultation with the priest would often begin not with an examination of the tongue or the pulse, but with a deeply probing confession. For many, the relentless tyranny of wakefulness was inextricably linked to a nagging sense of guilt, a secret sin, or a perceived transgression against God's law. The belief was that an unburdened soul, free from the weight of iniquity, would naturally find peace, and with peace would come sleep. The very act of confessing, of laying bare one's perceived failings before a spiritual authority, could indeed offer immense psychological relief, a comforting balm to a troubled conscience. For some, the anxiety stemming from religious scrupulosity might genuinely be a root cause of their insomnia, and in such cases, sincere confession and absolution could theoretically pave the way for a more restful night. But, of course, This only addressed a very specific, and perhaps minority, form of insomnia, leaving the vast majority of physically tormented sleepless souls still very much awake. If confession alone proved insufficient, or if the sleeplessness was deemed to be a more severe spiritual malady, the priest might prescribe a regimen of intense spiritual discipline. This often included rigorous penance designed to purify the soul and demonstrate fervent devotion. Imagine, if you will, a peasant woman, her eyes perpetually shadowed from weeks of wakefulness, kneeling on the cold, damp stone floor of the village church, hour after hour, reciting endless paternosters and Ave Marias, her knees aching, her back protesting, her mind cycling through prayers instead of dreams. Or perhaps being instructed to fast for extended periods, or to perform acts of self-flagellation, striking oneself with bundles of nettles or light whips, all under the grim belief that physical suffering would appease divine wrath and bring spiritual peace, thereby unlocking the elusive gift of sleep. The irony, of course, was that these acts of extreme devotion, while perhaps purifying the soul in a theological sense, were physically exhausting and often painful, driving the body into a state of collapse that might indeed lead to a shallow, unrefreshing sleep. It was not the rest of true slumber, but the unconsciousness of sheer bone-deep fatigue, induced by the rigors of religious devotion rather than any actual physiological cure for insomnia. One might wake up feeling spiritually lighter, but physically even more battered and weary. Beyond personal penance, the Church offered an array of protective measures against the unseen forces believed to cause sleeplessness. Holy water, blessed by the priest, was a potent weapon against demons and malign spirits. A sleepless individual might be advised to sprinkle holy water liberally around their bed, across their threshold, or even to drink small quantities of it before retiring, in the hope that its purifying power would cleanse the space and repel any nocturnal tormentors. Similarly, the use of sacred objects was common. Small crucifixes, rosary beads, fragments of blessed cloth, or even genuine or purported relics of saints, a bone shard, a strand of hair, a piece of clothing might be placed directly under the pillow or held close to the body throughout the night. The belief was that the inherent holiness of these objects would create a divine barrier, offering protection and peace. The comforting presence of a tangible symbol of faith might indeed alleviate some of the psychological distress associated with fear of the dark or spiritual attack, but for the sufferer whose sleeplessness stemmed from chronic pain, an uncomfortable mattress, or simply the biological quirk of their own sleep cycle, a relic beneath the pillow was unlikely to achieve anything more than a new lump. For the most severe and seemingly intractable cases of sleeplessness, especially those accompanied by bizarre dreams, hallucinations, or fits of agitation, the ultimate and most terrifying intervention was the possibility of exorcism. If the sleeplessness was a sign of demonic oppression, then a priest, typically one with specific training or an established reputation for spiritual warfare, might be called upon to perform a ritual to cast out the malevolent entity. While full-blown possession leading to levitation and speaking in tongues was rare, milder forms of demonic influence, manifesting as profound despair, uncontrollable thoughts, or unrelenting sleeplessness, were often attributed to such forces. The exorcism ritual itself could be a harrowing ordeal, involving lengthy prayers, demands for the demon to reveal itself, and often the physical restraint of the afflicted individual. If, by sheer psychological shock and exhaustion, the person eventually collapsed into a temporary stupor, it was hailed as a victory against the forces of evil, rather than a physiological reaction to extreme stress. The patient might sleep for a few hours, only to awaken to the same terror, now compounded by the memory of the exorcism. Master Elara Sprout, with her more earthy and less overtly spiritual approach, would have had a complex relationship with the Church's influence. On the one hand, she understood that many of her clients would have first sought divine intervention, often finding it wanting in its tangible effects. This created an opening for her to present her physical remedies as a necessary complement. She might even subtly critique the Church's approach, suggesting that while prayer was undoubtedly vital for the soul, the body's humors often required a more practical adjustment, a task for which only her potent concoctions and curious rituals were suited. She might even blend the two, advising a client to seek both prayer and her lunar lullaby draft, thereby covering all spiritual and humoral bases, and ensuring she maintained her own relevance. She might bless her own herbs with an incantation she derived from some forgotten pagan text, claiming it was an ancient form of spiritual purification, making her own remedies seem just as potent, if not more so, than the local priest's holy water. The Church, for its part, would have largely tolerated herbalists like Elixir, so long as they did not overtly challenge theological dogma or engage in practices deemed outright witchcraft. There was a pragmatic understanding that while God's will was supreme, some earthly ailments also required earthly intervention, even if that intervention was as nonsensical as Elixir's. However, the Church's overarching narrative that suffering was often spiritually driven meant that genuine physiological problems were frequently misunderstood and misaddressed. Insomnia, stemming from poor nutrition, a painful tooth, a flea infestation, or the simple anxiety of living in a harsh, uncertain world, was pathologized as a moral failing or a demonic curse. The remedies offered endless prayers, fasting, vigils, or the strategic placement of a saint's bone were potent spiritual tools. But medically, they were often ineffective or even counterproductive, adding physical stress to an already weary body. The enduring legacy of this era's approach to sleep is a poignant one. While modern science has unveiled the intricate neural pathways and hormonal balances that govern our sleep cycles, the medieval world grappled with the terrifying unknown, attributing restless nights to vengeful spirits and unbalanced humors. The Church, with its immense spiritual authority, offered solace and meaning, but in doing so, it often inadvertently perpetuated a cycle of ineffective treatment, directing the desperate insomniac towards solutions that brought spiritual comfort but little actual rest. The juxtaposition of a profound spiritual quest for peace with the mundane reality of a physical body yearning for sleep creates a darkly humorous tableau, a testament to humanity's enduring struggle with the quiet tyranny of wakefulness, and the often bizarre lengths to which we will go to escape its clutches, even when the advice comes from the holiest of places and is, for the purpose of sleep, entirely, delightfully, and utterly useless. This brings us, rather appropriately, to the chaotic, often baffling and deeply unscientific mind of Elixir herself, as revealed in her private musings. For Elixir, the grand tapestry of human suffering was not merely a collection of symptoms, but a rich field for her enlightened observation and self-proclaimed genius. And nowhere is this more evident than in the very pages of her personal journal, her dream diary, a collection of observations, theories, and scientific breakthroughs scrawled in faded ink upon rough parchment-like paper, bound between two pieces of dried, slightly brittle leather. This tome, perpetually smelling of mildew and something vaguely unidentifiable but organic, was her most prized possession, a testament to her superior understanding of the human condition and the nocturnal realm. It was here, in this haphazard collection of thoughts, that the true comedy of errors unfolded, a glorious symphony of confidently asserted nonsense. Her handwriting, often rushed and sprawling, would lean precariously across the page, frequently accompanied by crudely drawn illustrations of gnarled plants that bore only a passing resemblance to anything found in nature, or peculiar, almost alien, diagrams of cosmic alignments that seemed to defy all known astronomy. The margins were often filled with additional thoughts, corrections, or more commonly, furious scribbles when a particular remedy failed to yield the desired or indeed any result. Reading through Elara's dream diary is less about gaining insight into medieval medicine and more about witnessing a mind utterly convinced of its own brilliance, even as it consistently stumbled in the dark. One particular entry, dated by a moon phase rather than a year after the third waning crescent of the last harvest moon, describes a patient, a sturdy farmer named Theron, who suffered from the great restless leg affliction. Elara's scrawled notes reveal her initial assessment. Theron, a man of strong build, yet his humors are in disarray. His blood runs too quick, agitated by the moon's pull, preventing the black bile from settling his spirit. He reports his legs do dance, even when his mind wishes for stillness. This is the work of the restless spirit of the North Star which pulls at his sinews. Her proposed solution, jotted down with an air of profound discovery, was to administer a daily sedation poultice made of pounded willow bark, a rare sensible ingredient, though for pain not sleep directly, mixed with the dried scales of a particularly sluggish fish, caught from a stagnant pool, of course, and bound together with the milk of a cow that had recently calved under a full moon. This poultice was to be applied directly to the soles of Theron's feet each night, along with a thrice daily draught of her lunar lullaby, now with an added pinch of dust from a forgotten tomb to anchor the spirit to the earth. Her follow-up entry, perhaps a week later, paints a vivid picture of the inevitable outcome. Theron returned, much agitated. Reports no cessation of his leg dancing, but rather a profound itching where the poultice lay, and his stool is now loose as a goose. The dust from a forgotten tomb has, it seems, stirred his inner waters, not settled them. This is not a failure of the remedy, but a testament to the stubbornness of the North Star's influence. It pulls too strongly. Perhaps the black bile is too thin. Must thicken it. Consider adding more ferrous matter. Perhaps rust from a church bell. The casual suggestion of rust from a church bell, presumably to be ingested, illustrates her complete disregard for actual toxicity, her science bending to accommodate every failed outcome. Another entry, marked simply the Weaver's Nightmare, details the plight of a young woman named Isolde, plagued by vivid, terrifying dreams and an inability to achieve more than a fitful doggle. Elara's diagnosis was swift and confident. Isolde is afflicted by a waking demon, a creature of shadow that feeds upon her restful thoughts. Her flame is too thick, preventing the spirits from rising cleanly to her brain, thus trapping the demon within her dreaming. The night air, it has surely found a passage in her dwelling. Elara's recommended cure was a complex ritual, painstakingly detailed in her diary. Isolde must sleep with a protective circle of salt around her bed, harvested from the sea under a new moon. And within this circle, she must place 3 fresh eggs laid by a hen that has never seen a rooster. She must also consume a dream purge tincture upon waking, made of fermented urine collected on a Tuesday, mixed with the ashes of a burned raven feather, and a single drop of her own blood, drawn from the left earlobe. This will expel the demon through the lower passages. The subsequent entry regarding Isolde is a masterclass in deflection. Isolde has ceased her complaints of nightmares, but reports constant abdominal distress and a peculiar aversion to the taste of anything solid. Her complexion is pale, but her eyes, though sunken, appear less troubled by the shadow fiends. The dream purge tincture, while perhaps overly potent in its expulsion, has clearly driven forth the demonic presence. Her humors, though now agitated by the purge, are cleansed. The continued waking is likely from the lingering disturbance of the expulsion, and the absence of demons, which will now take time to adapt to. She must continue the salt circle, but perhaps reduce the tincture to a mere whisper upon the tongue. The abdominal distress, of course, was almost certainly a direct result of ingesting fermented urine and raven feather ashes, while the cessation of complaints was likely due to his old, being too weak, nauseous, and utterly bewildered to articulate her suffering, or perhaps too intimidated by Ilara's unwavering conviction. The diary also reveals Ilara's attempts at more generalized sleep science. In one particularly lengthy passage, she hypothesizes about the ideal sleeping environment. The ideal chamber for slumber must be sealed against the moon's direct gaze, for her silver light carries the whispers of forgotten fears and pulls at the blood's ebb and flow. No window should face the west, lest the lingering thoughts of the day's toil cling to the evening breeze. A small protective fire, made of oak kindling only, should burn low throughout the night, its smoke acting as a barrier against wandering spirits. And no human voice should be heard after the 7th hour, for sound vibrates the very soul and prevents its proper settling. This theory, if followed, would have led to a dark, smoky, utterly silent, and probably oxygen-deprived sleeping chamber, a far cry from restful, but certainly conducive to strange, unsettling dreams and a general feeling of suffocation. The demand for absolute silence in a medieval household, filled with large families and often livestock, was itself a ludicrous proposition, setting an impossible standard for her already suffering clientele. Ilara also meticulously documented her observations on the relationship between diet and dreams, a field she considered her particular genius. The eating of strong cheeses before bed, particularly those made from goat's milk, doth invite the goat-footed dream, full of leaping and climbing, which disturbs the spirit. Conversely, the eating of boiled root vegetables, prepared with unwashed river water, brings dreams of deep earth and quiet stillness, thus aiding sleep, unless the humors are too cold, in which case it binds the spirit to the soil and causes fearful shivering in the night. Her theories were a constantly shifting landscape of caveats and contradictory advice, ensuring that no matter what the patient consumed, Ilara could find a reason or blame for their continued wakefulness. The boiled root vegetables with unwashed river water would, in reality, likely induce more digestive distress and potential illness than soothing dreams. Her crowning achievement, perhaps in the realm of documented absurdity, was her celestial chart for dream interpretation and remediation. This complex hand-drawn chart, heavily annotated in her diary, purported to link specific planetary alignments with the intipi of nightmares a patient experienced, and thus the precise remedy required. If one dreamed of falling, it was due to Mars's fiery influence loosening the earthly bonds, requiring a poultice of heavy earthy herbs and a bath in cold spring water. If one dreamed of being pursued, it was Saturn's melancholic grip causing fear, necessitating the ingestion of humor's warming wine, even more wine than usual, and sleeping with a warm stone on the belly. The chart was a dizzying kaleidoscope of astrological conjecture, humoral theory, and bizarre folk remedies, none of which had any basis in reality, but all of which were presented with the unshakable confidence of a true visionary. The beauty of this system, from Ilara's perspective, was its absolute imperviousness to failure. Any continued sleeplessness or worsening of symptoms could simply be attributed to a miscalculation in the patient's exact time of birth, a particularly stubborn planetary alignment, or, as always, the patient's inherent humoral resistance to true healing. Through the pages of her dream diary, Master Ilara Sprout emerges not as a malicious charlatan, but as something far more unsettling and far more amusing. A genuinely deluded practitioner, utterly convinced of her own profound wisdom in a world desperately searching for answers. Her notes are a testament to the chaotic, unscientific, and often dangerous nature of medieval medicine, particularly when applied to the elusive art of slumber. They are a monument to the human capacity for self-deception, the comforting illusion of control, and the enduring, almost poetic, absurdity of seeking restful sleep through remedies that are, in fact, a bizarre comedy of errors recorded for posterity in a stained, cabbage-scented notebook. And as we close the metaphorical pages of this peculiar diary, the lingering questions are not just about the science or lack thereof, but about the sheer, unwavering faith of those who, in their desperate pursuit of a peaceful night, place their hopes, and often their very lives, in the hands of a 14th-century herbalist whose methods were truly a dark jest, a whispered lullaby leading not to sleep, but to a profound, unsettling wonder. Chapter 8. How to Die Peacefully, but Not from Sleep. We have observed Master Elara sprout in her peculiar domain, watched her brew her improbable elixirs, and perused the wild theories scribbled in her dream diary. We have seen the desperate medieval insomniac, grasping at any straw, however bizarre, in the relentless pursuit of rest. Now, in the chilling light of historical hindsight, we must confront the final, most darkly ironic truth about many of these 14th-century sleep remedies. They were, in a disturbingly significant number of cases, far more effective at ensuring a patient's eternal rest than a mere good night's sleep. The peace they ultimately offered was often the profound, unyielding stillness of the grave, rather than the gentle slumber of the living. Consider once more Elara's celebrated Luna Lullaby draught. At its base, a generous quantity of cheap, often unrefined wine. In large enough quantities, particularly for a body already weakened by poor nutrition and chronic ailments, alcohol alone could depress the central nervous system to a dangerous degree, leading to respiratory failure. But then Elara would add her crushed poppy seeds, an ingredient that, if accidentally sourced from the actual latex of the poppy plant rather than the relatively harmless seeds, could introduce potent opiates. Without any concept of dosage beyond a vague pinch or handful, a patient might receive a negligible amount, or, by a cruel twist of fate, a lethal dose. The outcome of such an overdose would not be peaceful, restorative sleep, but a slow, quiet descent into a coma, followed by cessation of breathing. The insomniac, seeking escape from wakefulness, would indeed find profound unconsciousness, but it would be a state from which they would not return. Elara, in her boundless delusion, would likely interpret this quiet passing not as a failure, but as a testament to the potion's profound efficacy in achieving ultimate tranquility. Perhaps lamenting that the patient's humors were too weary for this earthly plane, or that the moon's pull was simply too strong to resist, drawing their spirit to the heavens. Then there were the truly venomous botanicals that sometimes found their way into these desperate concoctions, often disguised by the doctrine of signatures or simple, fatal misidentification. Mandrake, henbane, and belladonna, as discussed, contain highly toxic anticholinergic alkaloids. These compounds, even in seemingly small doses, can wreak havoc on the human body. A patient given such a draught for sleep might initially experience a disturbing delirium, vivid hallucinations, or extreme agitation, followed by a period of profound unconsciousness. But this unconsciousness was a sign of severe poisoning, not sleep. Symptoms would rapidly escalate to a dangerously accelerated heart rate, convulsions, respiratory depression, and ultimately cardiac arrest. The sleep would deepen until it became irreversible, a final permanent quietude. The irony was devastating. The very substance meant to bring peaceful rest became the agent of permanent cessation. Elara would likely attribute the patient's demise to a particularly stubborn, perhaps demonic influence that the potion had bravely battled but ultimately succumbed to, or pre-existing weakness of the vital spirits that could not withstand the profound rebalancing her remedy initiated. Never, of course, the poison. Beyond the internal perils of potent, misdosed ingredients lay the external threats introduced by the 14th century herbalist's complete disregard for hygiene. The dream pillow stuffed with bat guano and shed serpent skin, the ritualistic baths in stagnant pond water, or the ingestion of dust from a forgotten tomb were not just bizarre. They were veritable petri dishes of pathogens. But guano can carry histoplasmosis, a fungal infection. Pond water is a breeding ground for bacteria, protozoa, and parasites, leading to dysentery, cholera, or other gastrointestinal infections that, in a time without antibiotics or rehydration therapies, were frequently fatal. Ingesting rust, as Elara once considered, could lead to tetanus. These were not immediate, dramatic deaths, but slow, agonizing declines. A patient, already weakened by chronic sleeplessness, would develop a fever, severe abdominal cramps, relentless vomiting and diarrhea, or painful, stiffening muscles. The body, unable to fight off the invaders, would simply waste away. The peace they found was the quiet surrender of exhaustion, dehydration, and overwhelming infection. Elara might note in her diary that the humors had cleansed themselves too vigorously, or that the inner fire of purification had burned too bright, consuming the patient in its righteous flame. The death would be attributed to natural causes, or a worsening of their initial melancholia, masking the true, iatrogenic cause. Then there was the popular, yet horrifying, intervention of bloodletting and leeches. While often not directly administered by herbalists like Elara, her humoral diagnoses frequently towards their necessity. A patient already suffering from chronic sleep deprivation and likely malnutrition would be further weakened by the removal of significant amounts of blood. This induced fatigue could indeed lead to a temporary collapse into unconsciousness, but it also left the body profoundly vulnerable. Anemia, extreme weakness, and a suppressed immune system made these individuals easy prey for the ubiquitous infections of the medieval world. A simple cut, an opportunistic infection from unsterilized instruments, or exposure to a common cold could quickly spiral into life-threatening sepsis or pneumonia. The body, drained of its vital fluids, simply lacked the resilience to fight. The peace was not a true rest, but the body's ultimate, final surrender to overwhelming weakness. The irony here was particularly cruel. The very act intended to balance the humors and restore vitality ended up draining the patient of the very life force they needed to survive the harshness of their existence. The general advice dispensed by such herbalists, even seemingly benign suggestions, could also contribute to a fatal outcome. Insisting on sealing windows against night air led to stifling. Unventilated rooms ripe for the spread of respiratory diseases. Ritualistic fasting, ostensibly for spiritual cleansing or humoral rebalancing, would further weaken an already frail individual, pushing them closer to the brink. The constant fear and anxiety instilled by theories of demonic possession or witches' curses, combined with the discomfort of the remedies, could lead to a profound psychological breakdown, leaving the sufferer in a state of despair that might hasten their physical decline, a form of giving up that led to a final, quiet collapse. In a world where life expectancy was already brutally short and infant mortality tragically high, any additional stress or physical insult could easily tip the balance from precarious health to final demise. Master Elara Sprott, with her magnificent self-confidence, would never have seen these outcomes as her fault. Every death was a learning opportunity, a data point to refine her labyrinthine theories. If a patient died, it merely proved their humors were too stubborn, their celestial alignments too cursed, or their faith too weak for her powerful remedies to take hold. She might even view it as a success of sorts, a dramatic and final cessation of their restless suffering, a triumph of her potent methods in guiding the soul to its ultimate, peaceful slumber. Their patient, after all, was no longer complaining of sleeplessness. The ultimate irony, then, is that the 14th century herbalist, in her earnest but ignorant pursuit of sleep, often became an unwitting, unintended, yet horrifyingly effective agent of death. The promise of a good night's rest often ended in a different kind of eternal peace, a grim testament to why, when it comes to sleep advice, one should always look beyond the 14th century, lest the cure prove more final than the affliction. The silent, peaceful darkness they sought was often found not in a warm bed, but beneath cold earth. Chapter 9. The Plague Doctor's Sleep Tips. Even worse, we have catalogued Master Elara Sprout's peculiar genius, charting her humoral acrobatics and the terrifying contents of her dream diary, all in the misguided pursuit of a good night's sleep. We have witnessed the lengths to which a 14th century insomniac would go, submitting to strange elixirs and even stranger bloodletting, all under the chilling premise that relief might be found. But now we must descend into an even deeper, more fetid pit of medieval medical absurdity, one where the stakes were infinitely higher, and the remedies, if possible, even more bewilderingly awful. For our journey would not be complete without considering the advice, or rather the desperate pronouncements of the Plague Doctor, a figure whose very existence was a testament to the utter terror and incomprehension that gripped the medieval world in the face of widespread, inescapable death. If Elara's sleep tips were a comedy of errors, the Plague Doctor's were a macabre, grotesque farce. The Plague Doctor was not your everyday physician. They were usually not formally trained university scholars, but rather municipal employees, often second-rate doctors or even laymen, hired by desperate towns to treat plague victims during the terrifying outbreaks of the Black Death. Their primary function was less about curing and more about recording deaths, performing autopsies, and offering what meager comfort or even more meager remedies they could to a populace gripped by unimaginable fear. Their iconic attire, the long, black, waxed canvas coat, the wide-brimmed hat, and most famously, the bird-like mask with a long beak stuffed with aromatic herbs, was less a fashion statement and more a desperate and utterly futile attempt at personal protection against the miasmas of disease. Their world was one of agony, putrefaction, and imminent demise. And in such a world, the relatively minor inconvenience of insomnia often took on a terrifying new dimension, becoming a symptom not just of restless humors, but of impending doom. For the Plague Doctor, the concept of sleep was often intertwined with the very real possibility of death. A prolonged stupor could be a sign of the disease tightening its grip, or a fitful, feverish sleep might be seen as the body battling the noxious vapors of the plague. Their medicine was, therefore, not aimed at inducing gentle slumber, but at expelling the pestilence or purifying the corrupted humors before it was too late. And these interventions were, by their very nature, violent, shocking, and almost certainly guaranteed to keep anyone, even the most exhausted soul, wide awake with fear. Consider, for a moment, the Plague Doctor's approach to the pervasive miasma theory. While Elara Sprout might have fretted over night air and suggested burning some sulfur, the Plague Doctor's response was a full-scale assault on the atmosphere. They would advise the constant burning of strong-smelling woods, resins, and herbs within the afflicted home, ostensibly to purge the air of the pestilence. This would often include frankincense, myrrh, camphor, or even gunpowder, creating a choking, acrid smoke that would irritate the lungs and eyes, undoubtedly preventing any semblance of peaceful rest. Imagine trying to drift off in a room thick with pungent, stinging smoke, your throat raw and your eyes watering, all in the name of purification. Far from inducing sleep, it was a recipe for perpetual coughing, eye irritation, and a frantic desire to escape the very air you were forced to breathe. The irony here is that good ventilation, not choking smoke, was what was needed, but medieval understanding clung desperately to the visible and the pungent. Beyond fumigation, the Plague Doctor's primary, and most terrifying intervention for almost any ailment, including symptoms that might be misinterpreted as insomnia, such as lethargy or agitation, was a more extreme version of the bloodletting that even our master Alara cautiously endorsed. While a barber surgeon might draw a mere cupful of blood, the plague doctor, operating under the desperate urgency of a widespread epidemic, would often prescribe bloodletting to the point of profound weakness, often using a lancet or, even more horrifyingly, hot irons to open veins and encourage copious bleeding. The idea was to draw out the bad humors and the corrupted blood that was believed to carry the plague. For an insomniac, this would be justified by claims that the sleeplessness was a sign of agitated blood fighting the pestilence, and that only by draining it could peace be found. The result, of course, was an immediate, terrifying collapse due to hypovolemic shock. Such a patient would indeed sleep, but it would be the unconsciousness of a body shutting down, a precursor to death, rather than a restorative slumber. Waking from this sleep would be a painful, disoriented re-entry into a world of extreme weakness, leaving the patient even more vulnerable to the actual plague they were ostensibly being cured of. Cupping, too, was taken to extremes. Instead of simple glass cups, plague doctors might use heated horns or metal cups, creating a powerful vacuum to draw out what they believed were the infected humors from the surface of the skin, often leaving angry, bruised welts. For sleeplessness, these might be applied to the head or neck, positions believed to influence the brain and its vapors. The pain and discomfort of such a vigorous cupping session, coupled with the lingering soreness and bruising, would ensure that any hope of comfortable sleep was thoroughly extinguished. But perhaps the most truly bizarre, and frankly disgusting, advice from a plague doctor for sleep, or rather, for general well-being that might incidentally lead to rest, revolved around external applications. One popular, if revolting, remedy was the application of live, freshly plucked chickens to the buboes, the painful, swollen lymph nodes that were the hallmark of the plague. The chicken's hindquarters would be shaved and pressed against the bubo, the belief being that the chicken would draw out the pestilence from the body. While this was primarily for the plague itself, a patient enduring the pain and discomfort of large buboes might well be unable to sleep. The constant squawking, fluttering, and eventual death of a chicken, which often succumbed to the pestilence it supposedly absorbed, would hardly contribute to a serene bedtime environment. Imagine trying to doze off with a live, agitated bird strapped to your groin or armpit, its frantic movements adding to your already considerable misery. And what of the deceased chicken? It was then disposed of, often by burning, adding to the general sense of miasma and unpleasantness. Another truly horrifying sleep or anti-pestilence measure involved the application of human excrement or urine. Some plague doctors, in their utter desperation and lack of scientific understanding, believed that the foulness of human waste could draw out or repel the foulness of the plague. Patients might be advised to apply poultices of human feces, or to wash themselves in stale urine, all in the name of cleansing. The stench, the discomfort, and the inevitable risk of infection from such practices would make any thought of peaceful slumber an absolute impossibility. One might pass out from the sheer revulsion, but that is hardly a restful sleep. The plague doctor's advice for mental well-being, which might indirectly relate to insomnia, was also deeply problematic. Faced with the overwhelming psychological toll of the plague, many doctors would recommend constant, vigorous activity or even self-harm to distract the mind from the disease, or to fight off the melancholic humors that plague was thought to induce. Rather than encouraging calm and rest, the advice was often to remain agitated, to keep moving, to think about anything but the impending doom. This might manifest as forced marches, repetitive physical tasks, or even the practice of self-flagellation, beating oneself with whips to atone for sins believed to have caused the plague, or to purge the body of its ill humors. Such practices, while perhaps offering a grim psychological outlet, guaranteed physical exhaustion without true rest, often leading to deeper states of sleeplessness and despair. In contrast to Master Elara Sprout, who genuinely, if misguidedly, sought to induce sleep, the plague doctor's focus was almost entirely on fighting a deadly disease they scarcely understood. Any sleep that resulted from their treatments was incidental, a byproduct of extreme physiological shock, pain, or utter exhaustion. Elara, in her small-scale domestic absurdity, operated within a realm of relatively minor discomforts and gradual decline. The plague doctor, by contrast, lived and worked in a perpetual state of emergency, dealing with agony and death on an industrial scale. Their sleep tips were not about gentle sedation or humoral balance. They were desperate, last-ditch efforts to stave off the black abyss, often speeding up the journey towards it. The comparison paints a stark picture. If a 14th-century herbalist offered sleep advice that was largely ineffective and occasionally lethal, a plague doctor offered advice that was almost universally terrifying, acutely painful, and far more likely to ensure permanent, rather than temporary, rest. The fear, the desperation, the sheer lack of any rational understanding of disease mechanisms pushed medieval medicine to its most extreme and grotesque limits during times of plague. The insomniac turning to such a figure would not be seeking solace, but simply another gamble against the overwhelming odds of the era. The quiet solace of a peaceful night was an alien concept to these grim figures, whose very profession was defined by suffering, and whose cures for restlessness were more likely to usher in the ultimate stillness. The only real sleep on offer from such a quarter was the final, unawakening kind. Chapter 10. A modern sleep scientist reacts to medieval wisdom. We have journeyed, with a mixture of bewildered fascination and quiet horror, through the dimly lit, pungent world of 14th-century sleep remedies, peering into the chaotic mind of Master Elara Sprout, witnessing the desperate plight of her sleepless clientele, and even braving the ghastly wisdom of the plague doctor. Now, it is time to drag this entire historical spectacle, kicking and screaming, into the harsh fluorescent glow of modern scientific understanding. 1. Imagine, if you will, a contemporary sleep scientist, perhaps Dr. Aris Thorne, a man whose life is dedicated to the intricate dance of neurons, the subtle ebb and flow of circadian rhythms, and the precise measurements of brain waves during REM sleep. Dr. Thorne, with his impeccably white lab coat, his meticulously organized data, and a deep, almost spiritual reverence for randomized controlled trials, finds himself presented with the collected wisdom of Master Elara Sprout and her medieval contemporaries. The reaction, as you might imagine, is a fascinating blend of professional horror, profound exasperation, and perhaps a faint disbelieving chuckle that borders on hysteria. We present Dr. Thorne with the foundational theory of the four humors: blood, flame, yellow bile, and black bile. He listens patiently, stroking his chin, as we explain that sleeplessness was often attributed to an excess of sanguine humor, or an agitation of black bile. His eyebrows, already slightly furrowed with academic concentration, rise imperceptibly. So, if I understand this correctly, he begins, his voice calm, measured, accustomed to explaining complex neurophysiology to undergraduates. The entire diagnostic framework for what we now understand as a complex interplay of neurochemical signals, environmental factors, and psychological states was based on the concept of imbalanced bodily fluids. He pauses, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his left eyelid, and the solution to this humoral disequilibrium was frequently, if not always, to remove large quantities of said fluids from the body. We nod, presenting the evidence of bloodletting and leeches. Dr. Thorn closes his eyes for a moment, a deep, silent sigh escaping him. Right, Del. So, for a patient already experiencing physiological stress from lack of sleep, potentially malnourished, and likely dehydrated from the rigors of medieval life, the cure was to induce further acute physiological stress by draining their blood, which, yes, would certainly lead to unconsciousness. A form of sleep, I suppose, if you define sleep as a state of profound systemic shock induced by hypovolemia, the body shutting down. Not exactly restorative sleep, is it? More like a temporary, medically induced coma. And the leeches? The risk of infection alone, in an era without antibiotics. He trails off, shaking his head. It's not just ineffective, it's actively detrimental. It's a miracle anyone survives such treatment long enough to complain about continued insomnia. Next, we delve into Ilara's famed elixirs. We describe the copious amounts of cheap wine used as a base, and the scientist nods grimly. Alcohol, Dr. Thorne states, is a sedative, yes, but it fragments sleep, suppresses REM sleep, and leads to rebound insomnia. It's a quick fix that fundamentally disrupts the very architecture of healthy sleep. To use it as a primary cure is to trade one problem for several worse ones. Then, we bring up the crushed poppy seeds, the mandrake, the henbane, the belladonna. Dr. Thorne's calm demeanor begins to crack. Opium, yes, a powerful sedative, but the lack of dosage control is terrifying. It's a fine line between sedation and respiratory depression. A pinch could be nothing, or it could be a fatal overdose. And mandrake? Henbane? Belladonna? He leans forward, his voice rising slightly. These are sources of atropine, scopolamine. These aren't just sedatives. They're potent anticholinergic toxins. They induce delirium, hallucinations, tachycardia, coma, and yes, death. We use these in highly controlled pharmaceutical settings for very specific purposes, in microgram doses. To ingest these by the handful for sleep. It's a poison, not a cure. It's not about making you sleep. It's about shutting down your central nervous system permanently. The peaceful death observation is chillingly accurate. It wasn't about rest. It was about ensuring the patient would simply cease to be restless. And the fermented urine and bat guano. That's just an invitation for a host of bacterial infections and parasites. The dysentery would indeed make you too exhausted to stay awake, but again, that's not sleep. That's debilitating illness. We then move to the medieval fear of night air and the constant burning of aromatic, often acrid, substances. Dr. Thorne stares blankly for a moment. So their solution to poor ventilation. Which itself contributes to respiratory issues and discomfort, was to make the air even more unbreathable, to fill confined spaces with smoke and irritants. We know that air quality, temperature, and ventilation are crucial for sleep hygiene. Creating an environment that's smoky, stuffy, and likely oxygen-deprived would guarantee restless nights, coughing fits, and respiratory distress. It's a self-inflicted wound, born of complete misunderstanding of basic atmospheric physics and human physiology. The discussion turns to demons, witches, and the mare of sleep paralysis. Dr. Thorne nods. Sleep paralysis is a well-documented phenomenon. It's a temporary dissociation between the sleep state and consciousness, often accompanied by hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations. It's terrifying, yes, but it's a neurological glitch, not a demonic visitation. And the cures, the amulets, the specific incantations, the blessed graveyard dirt, these are placebos. They might provide psychological comfort to someone who genuinely believes they are under spiritual attack. And that psychological comfort might reduce anxiety enough to allow eczema sleep. But for someone with obstructive sleep apnea, or chronic pain, or even simple poor sleep hygiene, A dried toad's leg under the pillow is going to do precisely nothing. In fact, sleeping on a lumpy pillow with strange objects beneath it would likely increase discomfort and disrupt sleep. We bring up Elara's dream diary, with its convoluted theories about the North Star causing restless legs, or goat cheese leading to goat-footed dreams. Dr. Thorne winces. The human brain, even in sleep, tries to make sense of the world. Our dreams are influenced by our daily experiences, our emotional state, our physical discomfort. To attribute restless legs to a distant star's pull on the sinews, when we understand it as a neurological disorder, or a symptom of iron deficiency. It's a testament to the human need for explanation, however outlandish. And diet idiocy affects sleep and dreams, but not in the whimsical, superstitious way Elara describes. Eating heavy, indigestible foods close to bedtime, or things that cause gastrointestinal upset, will absolutely disrupt sleep. But it's about the physiological burden on the digestive system, not about a goat-footed demon entering your dreamscape. He pauses, running a hand through his hair. What's striking is the sheer confidence in the face of consistent failure. No data collection, no reproducible results, no understanding of cause and effect beyond it felt right, or the patient stopped complaining. The lack of scientific method is profound. Every failure is externalized. It's the patient's stubborn humors, malicious planetary alignment, or insufficient faith. There's no feedback loop, no mechanism for self-correction. It's a closed system of self-affirming delusion. Dr. Thorne leans back, a weary but insightful expression on his face. When we look at modern sleep science, we talk about sleep architecture, the distinct stages of NREM and REM sleep, the role of neurotransmitters like adenosine and melatonin, the critical importance of a stable circadian rhythm. We understand sleep as a fundamental biological process, essential for cognitive function, memory consolidation, immune health, and emotional regulation. We address insomnia through cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, which helps reframe negative thoughts about sleep and establishes healthy sleep habits. We use light therapy for circadian rhythm disorders and, in some cases, carefully prescribed short-term medication that targets specific sleep pathways, with rigorous monitoring for side effects and dependency. We focus on creating a dark, quiet, cool, and comfortable sleep environment. We advise avoiding alcohol, heavy meals, and stimulating activities before bed. We address underlying medical conditions, from pain to sleep apnea, that disrupt sleep. It's all based on decades, centuries of empirical observation, controlled experiments, and an evolving understanding of human physiology. He gestures vaguely at the imagined tableau of Elara's hovel. And then you have this. This is not just bad medicine. It's barely medicine at all. It's a fascinating, if terrifying, window into a time when human suffering met utter ignorance, clothed in mysticism and desperate hope. The people were suffering genuinely from lack of sleep, and they turned to the only experts available who, with good intentions or perhaps just a desire for coin, offered them concoctions and rituals that were, at best, inert placebos with unpleasant side effects, and at worst, actively poisonous or debilitating. The irony is excruciating. The very quest for peace often led to more pain, more fear, and sometimes a final permanent rest that was anything but restorative. It underscores, rather dramatically, why you absolutely, under no circumstances, should ever take sleep advice from a 14th-century herbalist. It's a hilarious, tragic, and profoundly unsettling reminder of how far we've come, and how precious our current understanding of sleep truly is. It's a narrative that should make anyone grateful for a comfortable mattress, a quiet room, and the comforting knowledge that their sleep problems, however annoying, will likely not be cured by an application of bat guano or a vigorous bloodletting ritual performed by a local barber. And with that thought, perhaps a truly restful slumber might at last begin to beckon. Neat. Chapter 11. Surviving the Night. What people actually did. We have peered into the chaotic mind of Master Elara Sprout, watched her stir dubious elixirs, and cringed at the prospect of bloodletting and bat guano. We have seen how the medical wisdom of the 14th century, whether from self-proclaimed herbalists, stern priests, or beak-plagued doctors, often served to deepen confusion or hasten demise, rather than provide a simple, restorative night's sleep. But in a world where such professional advice was, at best, utterly useless, and at worst actively lethal, what did the average long-suffering medieval person when their humors were stubbornly unbalanced, their windows sealed against miasmas, and their bedside amulet failing to deter the dreaded mare? The answer, as is so often the case with history, is a mixture of profound resignation, ingenious, if often unwitting, adaptation, and the brutal, undeniable truth that life itself, with its relentless demands, often proved to be the most potent, if ungentle, soporific of all. For many, the first and most universally available cure for insomnia was simply the sheer, unadulterated exhaustion that was the hallmark of medieval life. Before the advent of artificial light, before the relentless hum of industry, life was dictated by the sun and the raw demands of physical survival. From dawn until dusk, peasants toiled in fields, artisans labored in workshops, and housewives managed sprawling, demanding households. There was no leisure time in the modern sense, no evening spent scrolling through glowing screens or contemplating existential dread from the comfort of a cushioned armchair. Instead, there was chopping wood, drawing water, tending livestock, grinding grain, mending clothes, preparing food over open fires, and 1,000 other physically demanding tasks that stretched from the first glimmer of light to the last fading embers of twilight. The human body, subjected to such relentless physical exertion day in and day out, possessed a remarkable, almost desperate capacity to simply shut down when the opportunity finally presented itself. Many a sleepless night would eventually capitulate to the overwhelming fatigue of a body pushed to its limits, collapsing onto whatever hard surface was available, be it a straw pallet or a simple dirt floor. This wasn't peaceful slumber. It was the heavy unconsciousness of a body screaming for respite, a primal, involuntary surrender to the tyranny of weariness. Furthermore, the very concept of one long night's sleep was largely foreign to the medieval mind, especially in rural communities. Before the pervasive influence of artificial illumination, sleep was often biphasic, meaning it occurred in two distinct segments. People would retire shortly after dusk, experience a first sleep for a few hours, then awaken in the dead of night for an hour or two of wakeful interlude, before returning to bed for a second sleep until dawn. This midnight waking period was not considered insomnia, but a natural and accepted part of the nocturnal rhythm. During this time, people might tend to the fire, check on livestock, pray, engage in quiet conversation, perhaps even perform light chores or reflect on their dreams. For those genuinely struggling to achieve sleep, this fragmented pattern might have inadvertently provided a psychological pressure valve. The expectation wasn't to fall into a deep, uninterrupted slumber immediately, but to embrace the natural ebb and flow of unconsciousness and wakefulness throughout the dark hours. The wakeful interlude might have been a time of quiet contemplation, a moment for the restless mind to process the day's events without the added anxiety of failing to sleep. In a strange, counterintuitive way, the very acceptance of broken sleep as a norm might have alleviated some of the modern insomniac's self-defeating anguish about not being able to sleep. Beyond this natural pattern, many individuals simply resorted to what modern parlance would call self-medication, albeit without the refined dosages or scientific understanding. Alcohol, primarily in the form of ale or weak wine, was a staple of the medieval diet, often consumed throughout the day, not just for merriment, but also because it was safer to drink than often contaminated water. For the sleepless, a few extra tankards of ale before bed might have been the simplest, most accessible remedy. The dulling effects of alcohol could indeed induce a heavy, albeit shallow, stupor. This was sleep born of chemical suppression, not genuine rest. The consequence, however, was often fragmented sleep later in the night as the alcohol wore off, compounded by dehydration and the general unwellness of a hangover in a world without pain relievers. It was a trade-off, temporary unconsciousness for a worse waking state, but a trade many were desperate enough to make. While Master Elara's herbal concoctions were often dangerous, medieval people also possessed a more nuanced, if still largely unscientific, understanding of certain genuinely calming plants. Some might have brewed simple infusions of more benign, if mildly effective, herbs. Chamomile, though its sedative properties are mild, was known and used for its calming effect. Valerian root, still used today, has genuine anxiolytic and sedative properties. Lavender, known for its soothing aroma, could be incorporated into small sachets or pillows, offering a gentle if subtle aid to relaxation. These folk remedies, passed down through generations and tested through trial and error over centuries, with the unfortunate and dangerous errors simply being lost to the mists of time along with their unfortunate users, represented a more practical, less overtly dangerous approach than Elara's grand pronouncements. The key difference was often the method, a simple, warm herbal tea before bed, steeped for comfort and gentle effect, rather than a murky, multi-ingredient potion consumed with the expectation of a miraculous, perhaps violent, chemical knockout. For some, the sheer persistence of chronic pain or discomfort from untreated ailments or injuries could paradoxically become a pathway to sleep. A searing toothache, a festering wound, or the dull ache of arthritis might keep someone awake for hours. But eventually, the body's natural pain threshold and exhaustion would kick in. The mind, overwhelmed by the constant sensory input of agony, might simply shut down, seeking refuge in unconsciousness, however brief or restless. This was not a pleasant sleep, but a forced capitulation, a temporary reprieve from suffering rather than a true restorative rest. The dark humor here lies in the idea that sometimes the only way to escape one misery was to induce an even greater one, or to be so utterly consumed by physical torment that sleep became a form of self-preservation. Communal living, a defining characteristic of medieval society, also played a complex role. Most families, even those of moderate means, lived in single-room dwellings, often sharing space with multiple generations, neighbors, and even livestock. The concept of a private, quiet bedroom was almost unheard of. Beds might be shared, or people might simply sleep on straw pallets on the floor. This meant a constant cacophony of snores, coughs, murmurs, the rustling of straw, the shuffling of animals, and the creaking of old timber. For the modern insomniac, such an environment would be a nightmare. Yet, for the medieval person, it was simply reality. For some, the constant presence of others, their breathing, their warmth, might have provided a strange primal comfort, a sense of security against the unknown terrors of the night. The sounds of familiar life, rather than being a distraction, might have served as a reassuring lullaby, a testament to the fact that one was not alone in the vast, dark expanse of the medieval night. For others, however, it would have been an added torment, ensuring a constant state of fragmented wakefulness, and they would simply have to endure it. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, many medieval people simply accepted sleeplessness as another unavoidable hardship in a life already brimming with them. There was no internet to consult for sleep hacks, no doctor promising a swift chemical solution, no cultural expectation of perfect, uninterrupted rest. Life was hard, painful, and often short. Sickness was common, death ever present. Insomnia, in this context, was just another burden to be carried. Another facet of the human condition to be endured with stoicism and resignation. People prayed, not necessarily for sleep itself, but for strength to endure their trials. They rose with the sun, regardless of how little rest they had achieved, and faced the day's grueling labor. The sheer, relentless grind of survival meant that any period of wakefulness, no matter how prolonged or uncomfortable, would eventually be followed by a period of forced exhaustion. The body, pushed to its limits, would eventually succumb. So, while Master Ilara, Sprout, and her ilk offered outlandish, often dangerous, cures, the vast majority of medieval insomniacs likely survived their restless nights through a combination of inherent physical exhaustion, an adapted biphasic sleep pattern, occasional self-medication, simple, less harmful folk remedies, and above all, a profound, uncomplaining endurance born of a life lived on the very edge of survival. The sleep they found was often not the gentle, restorative kind we aspire to today, but a heavy, often restless unconsciousness, a temporary escape from the rigors of their existence. It was a sleep born not of scientific understanding or comfortable environments, but of pure, unadulterated weariness, a quiet, almost melancholic, testament to the sheer resilience of the human spirit in the face of truly awful advice and even more awful reality. And with that, we leave the 14th century, grateful for the relative comforts of our own beds and the merciful absence of bad guano in our pillows. Chapter 12. The Herbalist's Final Advice. Just give up after all the convoluted theories, the dubious credentials, the wine-based elixirs that were more likely to induce flatulence than slumber, the terrifying bloodlettings, the unsettling leeches, the fear of malevolent night air, and the solemn pronouncements of a church more concerned with sin than somnolence. We return, finally, to Master Ilara Sprout. She sits, perhaps in her leaning hovel, a year or two older, perhaps a bit more stooped, the pervasive scent of cabbage and mystery still clinging to her woolens. The years had passed, and despite her unwavering confidence, the cumulative evidence of her consistent failures was, if not acknowledged by Ilara herself, certainly felt by her increasingly weary clientele. The villagers, so desperate, had begun to learn, slowly, grudgingly, that a trip to Master Ilara often resulted in little more than a lighter purse, an upset stomach, and a renewed appreciation for the comparative comfort of their own lumpy, flea-ridden beds. It was on a particularly damp, miserable evening when the autumn rains lashed against the wattle and daub walls of her dwelling, that a new kind of client arrived. Not a robust farmer with dancing legs, nor a scullery maid plagued by waking demons, but an old man, thin as a scarecrow, his eyes sunken and rimmed with purple shadows, his hands trembling not from cold, but from sheer, unadulterated exhaustion. His name was Thomas, a cooper by trade, and he had not slept a full night in what felt like a lifetime. He had tried Ilara's lunar lullaby draught until his stomach rebelled against the cabbage water. He had slept with a sachet of batguano and serpent skin beneath his pillow until the lingering aroma gave him the dry heaves. He had even, in a moment of utter desperation, paid the barber surgeon for a moderate bloodletting, which left him too weak to lift a barrel, but no closer to slumber. He had confessed his every imagined sin to the priest, until the priest himself looked weary. Now he stood before Ilara, a ghost of a man, not seeking a cure, but perhaps just an answer, a reason for his endless, silent torment. Ilara, for once, did not immediately launch into a flurry of humoral diagnoses or astrological pronouncements. Perhaps it was the lateness of the hour, perhaps the relentless drumming of the rain, or perhaps, just perhaps, the sheer, profound weariness emanating from old Thomas resonated with a similar, deeply buried exhaustion within her own self. She peered at him, not with her usual intense scrutiny for signs of black bile or agitated sanguine, but with a gaze that held a flicker of something akin to recognition. She had seen this look before, not in her clients, but in the reflection of her own mirror on particularly long, unproductive nights when even her own concoctions failed to bring the promised oblivion. Her methods, her grand theories, her confident assertions, they were all weapons against the chaos of the unknown, elaborate constructs to impose order on a stubbornly disordered world. But sometimes, even Master Elara knew, the world simply refused to be ordered. She gestured for Thomas to sit on her rickety stool, a seat usually reserved for her most desperate or most gullible clients. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the mournful wind and the drip of water from a leak in the thatch. Thomas simply sat, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the uneven floor. He had no complaints left to voice, no new symptoms to describe. He was simply awake. Finally, Elara spoke, and her voice was uncharacteristically quiet, devoid of its usual theatrical flourish. "Master Thomas," she began, "your humors, they are resilient. Your vital spirits, they cling to wakefulness with a tenacity that defies the very moon itself. We have purged, we have soothed, we have appealed to the stars, and yet—" She trailed off, a rare moment of genuine hesitation. "And yet, the sleep, it does not come as we command it. The body, Master Thomas, it has its own will. A will sometimes stronger than all the herbs in the forest, and all the prayers in the chapel, and all the blood in a man's veins." She picked up a small, gnarled root from her workbench, turning it over in her fingers. It was just a root, plain and earthy, not one of her mystical ingredients. "Sometimes," she continued, her voice a low murmur, as if speaking more to herself than to him, "sometimes the night holds you. It does not release its grip. The mind, it races, the body, it aches, and the world outside the window seems to mock your stillness. We try to fight it, do we not? We try to bend the night to our will, to force the eyes to close, to coax the spirit into slumber. We drink vile potions. We allow leeches to feed. We whisper against the shadows. But the night, Master Thomas, is a stubborn thing. It does not always yield." A profound silence descended, heavier than the rain outside. Thomas, for the first time, looked up at her. A flicker of something new in his tired eyes, not hope, not despair, but perhaps understanding. Elara sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of all her accumulated failures, all the sleepless nights of her clients, and perhaps her own unspoken ones. She placed the root back on the table with a soft thud. "So, Master Thomas," she said, her voice now almost a whisper, her final piece of advice offered not as a remedy, but as a resignation, a surrender to the inevitable. Perhaps sometimes the best course is simply to give up the fight, to accept that this particular night it simply will not grant you peace. To lie still, yes. To breathe deeply, yes. But to release the need for sleep. To allow the weariness to settle, and if slumber chooses not to embrace you, then to simply be awake. To accept the quiet. To let the mind wander where it will, without judgment, without the desperate struggle, for the struggle itself. Master Thomas is often the greatest thief of sleep. It was an astounding pronouncement from Master Elara Sprout, the woman who had built her entire livelihood on the relentless pursuit of sleep. It was her most honest, and paradoxically, her most sensible piece of advice. In a world utterly lacking in effective treatments, in a time when understanding the nuances of the human body was a distant dream, the most practical solution to intractable insomnia was often simply to stop fighting it, to cease the frantic pursuit, to let go of the anxiety that fueled the sleeplessness, and to simply endure the wakefulness with a quiet, weary acceptance. It wasn't a cure, but it was, perhaps, the only truly non-toxic path to a semblance of peace. The body eventually would succumb to exhaustion, as it always did. The mind, unburdened by the desperate struggle, might find a moment of quiet reprieve. Thomas blinked slowly. He had paid for potions, for charms, for rituals, for agonizing procedures. He had expected another outlandish directive, another vile draught. He had expected a promise of rest, however false. Instead, he had received the bitter truth, a recognition of the futility of his quest, and an instruction to simply exist in his wakefulness. There was no scientific basis for this advice, no humoral realignment, no planetary influence, no exorcism. It was merely the weary wisdom of a woman who had, perhaps, seen enough restless faces to finally admit that some battles simply could not be won with newt bone and fermented cabbage. He rose from the stool, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his posture, a slight easing of the perpetual tension in his shoulders. He didn't feel cured, not by any stretch of the imagination, but he felt, perhaps for the first time, a sliver of relief from the relentless pressure to sleep. The pressure that had transformed his nights into a battlefield, his bed into a torture rack. If the sleep would not come, then perhaps he did not have to fight it quite so hard. He could simply be. And so, Master Lara Sprout, the eccentric herbalist of the 14th century, whose remedies were often more dangerous than the ailments they purported to cure, whose theories were a riot of misinformation and superstition, offered in the quiet, rain-soaked twilight of her career, her only truly profound and sensible advice on the matter of sleeplessness. It was a surrender, a concession to the stubborn reality of the human condition in a harsh, unforgiving age. It was the wisdom of desperation, born not of science, but of sheer, exhausting observation. When all else fails, and the night simply refuses to yield, sometimes the only way to find a semblance of peace is to abandon the struggle, to stop chasing the elusive shadow of slumber, and simply, profoundly give up. And with that, perhaps, the very act of not trying, the release of that relentless internal pressure might, just might, allow a weary mind to finally drift. Not into a forced coma of noxious herbs, but into the quiet acceptance of whatever rest, however brief, the night might finally deign to offer. This tale, then, stands as a final, ironic testament to the enduring human quest for sleep, and the often absurd paths taken, reminding us that sometimes the true wisdom lies not in the pursuit, but in the peaceful, if quiet, surrender to the inevitable. And as the rain continues its steady drumming on the thatch, and the darkness outside deepens, one might find themselves, too, letting go, if only for a moment, of the anxious grip of wakefulness, and simply existing in the quiet hum of the world.